Feel a little funny learning text with the two of you sitting there, but okay. Can we just take a minute and have people introduce themselves? I think that would be great. We have a small enough group. I feel like it's like a little weird with the poll. You want to maybe come over here? Is that okay? Mish, you want to go first?
My name's Mish. I teach Kurdish. I've known you a long time.
You've known me for a longer time.
I've known you for a long time, yes.
Bravender, same year.
Oh, really?
We went to like this development town together and did something.
Long time. I know, exactly.
That means I was in Providence that year too, but I was teaching, I think.
No, it was before. It was earlier.
It was probably like, 89.
89.
Oh, boy.
Fall of 89 I met you, I think. Also, we had Shabbos together at my Bravender's house. Do you remember that? Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
That was really interesting. Melissa, I've never spent Shabbos with you.
Consider that a Milo. Yeah.
I'm Jocelyn.
Jocelyn? Nice to meet you.
Batia.
All right.
Trying to see the connection.
Har'el.
It's my father.
What's your name?
Moshe Zev.
Zev, you're allowed to have your own identity.
Yes.
Is it okay if I sit? Yes. Okay. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time together thinking about an issue that personally I find just incredibly interesting, and I'm also a little bit interested in it in the meta level, which is why this incredibly interesting strand in the history of halachic discourse is so muted. It's basically the question of the fourth Yeharg val Ya'avor. And it was interesting, when I first started thinking about these Makorot like a year and a half ago, I started asking people I knew who were like, I wouldn't say like Talmidei Chachamim, but like really Yodei Sefer, and most of them had no idea what I was talking about. I find that actually kind of interesting. And one of the things that's most interesting about these sources, I think, is the nexus of halacha, ethics, and theology. We'll get to the theological part at the very end. So I wanted to think together about obviously the sort of technical things that are going on here in these sources, but also it seems to me that these sources are extremely interested, and Rabbeinu Yonah in particular, as we'll see, in the psychological experience of humiliation and how to think about that in religious terms. And so I hope the conversation is, would that all conversations about halacha were also conversations about deep human issues, but I think this one is sort of unavoidably about that, okay? So obviously, if you stop someone on the street who has a basic Jewish education and you say, how many mitzvot are they that are Har'el Beit Ya'avor, they'll all say 3, which are, right? Shfichut damim, avodah zarah, gilui arayot, right? And again, what's interesting is that major Rishonim actually hold that there are 4. That was, to be honest, for me, my first surprise was the realization this is not some obscure Rishon. This is like the Rif and the Tosfot. It's like really, really interesting. Okay, so let's actually just look at this together, and then we'll sort of draw out whatever conversation we can from this. So obviously, source 1. This was not made for you. Is the famous Gemara? I gave the source from Sanhedrin. There are others. Then comes the story of Yehuda and Tamar. And I'll say that I'm not 100% sure. I think Chazal's pshat is the necessary pshat, but I'm not totally sure it's the necessary pshat. Meaning, assuming that story is familiar, right? But meaning that what happens at the end of that story, as Chazal understand it, is that Tamar makes an active decision to only, as it were, confront Yehuda in private. I'm not sure confront is the right word, but to appeal to him in some way in private. Based on the words, I presume, Shilcha el Chamiha, which they take to mean Viraklo. Whether it necessarily means that, I'm actually not sure. Right? I think it's always interesting to think about when Chazal choose to read a story in a particular way because it bolsters a point. I'm not sure if we zoomed out of our rabbinic reading of the story, if we would assume that. Right? So that moment where Hishilcha el Chamia is the moment that gets this whole conversation going, or that generates it. So let's just read for a second source 3, starting from there. You have it?
I don't.
Oh, did you?
I didn't print them. The people got it in the email.
Oh, do people have it?
I think most people do. I just forgot my computer at home.
Oh, I don't have it anymore. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm good.
Share.
I'm good. I'm totally good.
We can share.
Okay.
He knows Shas Bal Peh.
Chas v'shalom.
He said Chas v'shalom.
Chas v'shalom, you should be choshish me that I...
What, so you want to read? Sorry, first?
Which one?
Mar Zutra Bar 2. 3.
Mazuta bar Tuvia, Amar Rav, Ve'amrila, Amar Rav Hana bar Bijna, Amar Rabbi Shimon Chasida, Ve'amrila, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rashbi.
To say something totally obvious here, you learn 2 things from this. Number 1, it's extremely important to Chazal to know who said this. Number 2, they don't know. Meaning, right, there's a lot of different masorot about who said this. Right? Okay?
נוח לו לאדם שיפיל עצמו לכבשן האש,
Try to speak up a little.
ואל יבין פניו חברו ברבים.
I think we should close the door.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
נוח לו, go ahead, שיפיל עצמו לכבשן האש ואל יבין פני חברו ברבים.
מנהלן, מתמר, דכתיב, היא מוצאת שלך אל חמיה.
Great, okay? So now, how would you, if you simply put down everything you think you know about the history of this phrase or halacha, if you read the phrase, Noach lo la'adam she'apil atzmo, to create a dichotomy I don't always love, halacha or agadah, what do you say? Agadah because the language of Noach lo suggests what to you exactly? Let's sort of flesh this out. I'm going to almost belabor this for a second. It's Eitzah Tova, right? No, it'll be better, preferable. Anyone want to argue the opposite position, that it's halacha?
Well, Nimnu V'Gamru, that it was Noach L'Adam. I mean, but I think that there's comedy in that statement also. I would say
The Nimnu V'Gamru part.
The Nimnu V'Gamru, that it's Noach L'Adam, that he...
But that's not even in this sugya.
Right, so
Oh,
it's the
right.
same language.
I see.
Noach. I mean, it's comic there too. The same... perhaps playing on the same things you're saying, that where it says in Eruvin that it'd be Noach lo l'adam, that he wouldn't have been created Masher Nivra, and they took a vote on it. As if it's a halachic decision that it would have been better that human beings are created, which maybe perhaps rubs that it's somewhere between in the Beit Shemashos area.
Okay.
Otherwise...
But how would you argue that it's halachic in a non-ironic way?
מנהלן?
Because you took a vote. What do you mean you take a vote?
But there's no, there's no
here,
vote here.
Oh, here.
There's no vote there's no vote here. This is a different sugya, right? There's no vote here.
Yeah,
But,
I'm just doing it because I'm trying to understand. I want to know how does Noach lo work in the Shas. So I'm looking at
that's interesting, whether you can do that with a phrase like that. Okay. You said minalan.
We usually say hadahu dechtiv or something like that in the midrashim.
Is that true in Agadot in the Bavli that you don't use minalan for non-halacha?
I don't think.
That's interesting.
Yeah?
You think that's right?
But you do use that?
I think you do use that. I don't think you use that all the time, but you use that. By the way, I want to make a totally different structure argument why someone could say this is halacha, which I think the moment I say it, maybe it will make sense. I think this is kind of implicit in the Pnei Yoshua on this sugya. Wait a second. Suicide is usher. You can't tell me that discretionarily I can kill myself. The only way it can be mutter, la pilat motoch kivshana eish, is if it's chayav and it trumps the isser on suicide.
But they don't mean
That's not supposed to be Rambam and Tosfot.
Yes, that's right. It's derivative of that
I mean, if you hold
machloket.
like the Rambam.
Exactly. It's derivative of that machloket. Yes, exactly. But such an argument could be made, is the point. I mean, what do you mean? You can't imagine a scenario where you're discretionarily given the permission to override an avera which loses your chelik in olam haba.
So you don't have to go so far. So if you're assuming that what guided Tamar is halachic considerations, quote unquote, or Chazal's interpretation of the story puts halachic considerations into that narrative, so the fact that it governs normative behavior is enough. Even if it's l'fnim mishurat hadin. The noach lo could be that you're allowed to, right? Let's keep it, stay close. But it governs a normative behavior.
You're saying, that's interesting. Your reading is the halachically you're permitted. Right. I think most people want to read this, want to say, no, halach. The problem is that doesn't do the work they want. Because it doesn't become Yahreg Val Yavor at that point.
Right.
Right? In other words, they don't want to just, to be clear, right? It seems to me they don't want to just generate that, yeah, it's fine, which seems to be what the language suggests, or it's permissible, or maybe even it's desirable. They want to say, no, you have no choice in this matter. You are chayav to die rather than do this. By the way, it's interesting. Speaking of interesting Chazal twists, this is something I actually really had never seen until Rav Yossi Slotnick said this to me yesterday. They shift the story in a certain way to understand Tamar as actively lahapil atzmo, not laharshot latzma, right? Lehizarek b'toch kivshana eish, but it actually becomes this clearly active moment of suicide on her part. something's going on there. I don't know what it is yet, but it is interesting. Okay, so it seems like the predilection, the sort of leaning of this group is clearly it's Agadah, but you could imagine why someone would make an argument that it's halacha.
Well, it appears 16 times in the Midrashei Halacha. Just for
You looking at Menelon?
No.
Noach lo. Huh?
Noach lo down is 16 times in the Midrash Halacha.
But what does it tell you?
Midrash Agadah. It's only in the Midrash Agadah. It's 9 times in the Bavli, but otherwise, what does that tell me? That tells me that it's a Agadic, that it's very much an Agadic phrase.
Yes. It seems to me, for what it's worth, by the way, I'm trying to be Melamed Zchut on the reading of this as halacha. Meaning, it seems to me pretty clear that this is an Agadic statement. But, it reminds me of something that Professor Jacob Katz used to say to his students. I've been told this by a bunch of people. He used to say, when you're learning a sugya, and you realize that the Netziv doesn't have pshat, you should sort of assume first that he did have pshat and chose not to have it. That would be the generous way of reading, right? So I'm going to assume that Tosfot are not, this is like, a third hermeneutical principle. Tosfot are not dumb. They realize that Noach lo is probably an Agadic statement. And so the interesting question to me on some level, I think this is like an interesting meta question, why is it so important for them to take a statement that seems to be Agadic and call it halacha lemas? And by the way, it's not a small halacha. It's not telling you like some chumrah and borer. It's telling you should kill yourself rather than let this happen. It's very strong. So I think reflecting on the meta level, Batya, please. Yeah.
Finish. Sorry.
No, go ahead, it's fine.
It just seems to me that there's an assumption here that like a person has such a high moral conscience that they would feel incumbent upon themselves to do this. But yet there might be a problem because this is a more subjective situation, not objective like the other three. So that's how the reading seems to me.
It's very interesting because I think a lot depends on how you understand that Noach lo. Is Noach lo meant to be intuitive or radically counterintuitive? Right, you're reading it intuitively. I actually kind of wonder whether it's intended to shock, in the sense of like, you probably, this is how Rabbeinu Yonah, I think, understands all of this move. You probably think in the end, humiliation, big deal, get over it. It's like Rabbeinu Yonah actually argues, at the risk of kind of going far ahead, we won't talk about this today, he actually argues the reason why Malbim B'nei Chavro B'Rabim is actually, for the sinner, worse than Ritzicha, is that if you're guilty of Ritzicha, on some level, unless you're really a sociopath, you know that you're Chayav B'tshuva. When you humiliate someone, 5 minutes later you have a narrative about why it wasn't a big deal. Right? So I would actually read this as counterintuitive.
No, I was just involved in a very, in a situation just like this, on a community level. And the person really was not at all, doesn't feel any remorse. Right.
So, right, exactly. Okay, so here, just putting all my cards on the table, I have wondered, I really don't know if this is right, if that is why it is important to many of these Rishonim to make this issue halacha. Because they know the Yetzer Hara that says, good advice, I can take it or I can leave it. You tell me it's usher, it's not just usher, it's Yahrig Val Yavor. Maybe I should take that seriously. It's precisely because they realize people rationalize all the time. And in a way, Rabbeinu Yonah may actually be giving away his cards by saying that, right? Why am I insisting this is Yahrig Val Yavor? The fact is, I know people rationalize humiliating people all the time, right? It seems to me that that's an argument for it being dafka counterintuitive.
True.
Right? Your reading is interesting, but in the end, I don't think it's convincing. I think it's flipped in a certain way. Does that make sense?
It's sarcastic.
I don't think it's sarcastic. I think it's almost aspirational. Would that we lived in such a way that people understood it would be better to do this than that. Halavai, right? And in fact is, we don't. Okay, just quickly, okay? Because you told me I have maximum an hour, right? The Rif. So 7 a.m., right? Okay, the Rif. Rabbeinu. Yazman. Okay, the Rif. This is not, there's nothing, quote unquote, interesting about this, but it's just important. The Rif, right? Just things in the Gemara that are, right? So, you read the line in the Rif now. Just read it again if you don't mind, Ariel. By the way, that's yet a fourth possibility of who said it. It seems like potentially a corruption of just the three options up there. Yeah. Okay, this is straight. The Rif Paskins this like it's straight halacha. By the way, I have a colleague at Machon Hadar who has the greatest idea for a Jewish book I have heard in many years. She wants to write a book about all the Memrot in the Bavli that are in both the Ein Yaakov and the Rif. Because she thinks, I don't know, she hasn't done full research. By the way, maybe 4 pages, right? But it's like, but the setting up of the question is extremely interesting, right? What are it is an interesting question how many there are. But like, what are the Memrot that are kind of like living in that Bein HaShmashot space? Okay, so the Rishonim who want to hold that this is halacha have a technical question. And it's sort of obvious once you say it, and yet it actually took me learning the Tosfot to realize the question. Wait a second, if I'm going to say there are 4 Yehoreg Val Yavors, well, why does the list that keeps appearing only have 3? Right? It's like a good question, right? How can I say that when there's a list? It's like that gets quoted, that little index card appears in a variety of places in Shas. How can there be a 4th?
But where's the lav?
Where's the lav of halbana? What do you mean by that? The explicit lav? Yes, so that's the Tosfot's answer. Tosfot's answer is, well, actually, let's read the Tosfot. Why don't you read the Tosfot? Let's just read from the Nireh. The 3rd line into that Tosfot in Sota. Just read what he said, because I think he's thinking about what you're asking. But he's going to flip it in the other way. The Nireh, go ahead. He's acknowledging what you're saying, but he's deflecting it too. Because he's saying, yes, the list is a purely technical answer. At least it seems it's a purely technical answer. The list, I have often wondered, you can tell me if you think this is crazy, or anybody can, if this Tosfot is in any way ironic. Because they're not Meforashot exactly, that they're Yehoreg Val Yavor. I mean, the Isur is, but calling them Yehoreg Val Yavor, if that's what he means, is actually done through Darshanut. So Meforashot B'Torah, the non-ironic reading is he just means, it never says, Lo talbin pnei chavercha. And it does say, right, but if he's trying to say something stronger than that even, then I wonder what's going on. I suspect it's the former, right, which is, but think about it, his technical answer is, it's not that those are the only things, it's that the list has a technical grounds for excluding it, but it's not excluded from the halacha itself. Was that sentence followable, what I just said?
It's like the other 3 things that are things that are capital offenses, and there's no havamina that halbanat pnei chaver barabim is a capital offense, and so.
Why is there no havamina? In whose mind is there no havamina?
In the minds of the rabbis, because it has to say in the Torah, if you do this, then you deserve to die. And there's only 36 such statements in the Torah, and this is not one of them. And
that leads you. This is all great. I'm still trying to figure where is that leading you? What's the maskana of what you're saying? And therefore,
well, I can't even. Therefore, clearly,
it sounds crazy to you.
It's absurd. I'm trying. Trying to get over the havamina of your shiur. Like I really am trying to get the havamina that this is a halachic statement that's meant to be taken seriously.
Well, by the way, I would never have thought that. Except, by the way, I don't think that. By the way, let me be clear. Wait, let me clear for a second. I think it's actually very important about what you said. I'm going to pick on you just for a second because it's a helpful thing to draw out. I think this statement is meant to be taken dead seriously, but not as halacha. I think that's precisely, again, that makes me wonder if that's what's animating the Tosfot a little bit, is I want this to be halacha, so you can't dismiss it as stam eitzah tova. There's something that's perverse about Jewish culture in that way. Well, it's not halacha, it's not a big deal. I think Chazal I think Chazal too, and then the Tosfot in a different way, want to amp up the volume here. No, I want you to take seriously how enormously grave it is to humiliate someone. I want you to understand that there are very few things that are graver. If for 1 minute you think it's like worse to eat a piece of pig than to humiliate someone, you don't know the first thing about rabbinic Judaism. I think that's what it's intended to do. It's the rhetorical overstatement is like, it's like actually, when I was writing my book on Heschel, for somewhat understandable reasons, I started doing research about hyperbole in literary theory and how hyperbole works. And hyperbole is supposed to take a grain of truth and then shake you with some really dramatic statement. This feels to me, the rabbinic statement, like a dramatic hyperbole. And in a way, I would say, if this may sound paradoxical, the Rif, the Tosfot, and Rabbeinu Yonah can be understood. I don't want to defend this because I'm not sure I can. Might be understood as using another form of hyperbole in saying, yes, this halacha l'maaseh. That itself is a form of hyperbole, right? Calling it halacha is a hyperbolic statement. Because it's obviously not a halachic statement. But that's a way of saying, but there's a shemetz here that really matters. I want you to take this seriously, even if not halacha l'maseh, right? You should think of it as unbearably grave to humiliate another person. Not the kind of thing where 5 minutes in, what'd I do, Betsy? What's the big deal? And that's... I actually agree with you, but I think that actually opens up a window, again, on like, why are they doing this? And in that sense, I think they think they're being continuous with the Gemara. Because the Gemara chooses to make this outrageous statement. Right? And so they're amping up the outrageousness as a way of saying, this really matters. Really, really, really matters.
So there's an important point here. I think that when Tosfot makes the distinction between Masha Katuv, Masha Lo Katuv, so the assumption that you were making is that the reason a particular Aveira might be Yehreg Val Yavor is because of the Isser Sheba, because it's Aser. So certain Aveirot, V'chai Behem, you can transgress the prohibition because of something greater. And other things where the prohibition, because this prohibition doesn't have the heter, so to speak, of V'chai Behem. When Tosfot says that it's not Mufurash B'Torah, and it's an independent fourth category of which there's no particular Isser associated with it, right? They're telling you that, they might be telling you that all Yehreg Val Yavor is not because of the Maisa Isser. It's not because of the act of doing something which the Torah says is Asr, but for another reason. In other words, even there may be the whole idea of not only is Gila Rayot Asr, but Kirvala Rayot is Asr. And the Gemara says that listening to her voice is Asr, right? And it's Yehreg Val Yavor. So nobody thinks that you chayav kares for that. Right? So it's not, quote unquote, the Maisa Aveira. I'm going to the Brisker formulation.
Yeah, it's totally Brisker formulation.
This is a Brisker
right?
formulation, for which I apologize.
It's the outcome.
But it's the outcome, and then it goes to what you're saying. You start with the halachic analysis. The halachic analysis is that you think it has to say, so it's the Maisa Isser. No, the fact that it doesn't say, but it's still there, means it's not the Maisa Isser. Then what is it? Now you take it from there. You understand?
That's like the Brisker formulation of what's going
on.
And
then it's one step beyond.
Right. Okay, great. So hold on. So let's read in light of what Misha said.
Since you go for it. Your head of your methodology, I'll just say that there's over 100 times that the rabbis kill people with their eyes, mitchayev benafsho. They use this expression all the time,
right.
Literally more than 100 times, where they say, Haroe Ilana Naed says, Mana Ilanazo, mitchayev benafsho, and they do it for everything.
Yeah, but see, it's interesting. I think that's true, but mitchayev benafsho is different from this a little bit.
It's a normative instruction.
It's a normative instruction. Exactly, it's a normative instruction here. By the way, I think there's a tshuva the Rivash where he basically says, look, there are some times when Chazal want you to take something seriously, so they basically just, he calls it the language of guz. They just, go into guzmala, and they do it all the time. But again, I think it's important not to deflect it by calling it a hyperbole, because again, a hyperbole is based on a claim that's real. If anything, so what I learned in this literary theory investigation of hyperbole is, when does hyperbole fail? Right? Hyperbole fails when the listener doesn't have any assumption shared, right, with the speaker, because then the hearer hears it as ridiculous as opposed to exaggerating. Follow what I just said? Was that English? So some literary theorists argue hyperbole is effective when, yeah, I know you're saying something important, but why are you going so far with it? It becomes ridiculous when the person says it and you think, what are you even talking about? I don't know what your assumptions are. And I guess here I want to make sure that we understand that, if anything, these Mekorot would want us to see this as hyperbole, but not ridiculousness, right? And what I'm worried about, Misha, is the way you're pushing it is it's ridiculous. I don't think it's ridiculous. I think it's dramatically hyperbolic. And it's about centering a certain vision of the ethical and the reality of the person in front of you. And I'm not trying to make that into Levinas. I just think but that's what it's about. It's about humiliation, and what does it mean to do that to another human being? So to push that point further, look at Rabbeinu Yonah. This is in Sharei Tshuva. He says more or less the same thing in his Perush on Pirkei Avot. Anyone want to read this? This is very straightforward. Do you have it? Oh, yeah, that seems like cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, you want to read it, or should I read it? Number 6. He just gave you his explanation. That's it. You could stop there for a minute. This is an amazing argument. Tosfot asked the question, right? Why isn't this on the list? And gave you a technical answer because the list is compiled in this way. Rabbi Yonah effectively says, what are you talking about? It is on the list. It is on the list. Avakrat Tzicha is Kalul B'Tzicha. Rav Herzl and I were talking before about this conversation. Like I had been thinking about the language. I'm not sure Rabbi Yonah loved this language. Ritzicha is an Av. Halbana Panim is a Tolada. Right? It is a junior version of the same thing. By the way, so I was telling you before, I spent a lot of time, when I first was working on these sources a few months ago, I was going to teach them in a shiur where I had to also give English translations. And I'm embarrassed to tell you how much time I spent sitting on my computer trying to figure out how to translate Avakrat Tzicha. Right? Really, really hard. I ended up with, I said shades of murder. A friend of mine who's a wise guy said gunpowder, Avakrat Tzicha. So he basically says something really interesting. It is actually on the list. And then he's going to give you a kind of, using sources in the Gemara, he's going to give you a kind of psychological explanation. Should I spare you from this, or do you want to keep going? Should I spare you from this? Can you see? Okay, good. If you can see, then great. Right? Okay, so when blood drains out of the face, it's like Ritzicha. Since we won't have a lot of time, I would just mention that there's a really interesting physiological question here, which is that most people, when they feel humiliated, first turn red, not white. So, I once gave this shiur at a shul, and this is like, what happens in your Jewish community. Some guy gets up and says, I'm a psychoneurologist. I got to tell you have to tell me what you're talking about, because embarrassment, shame, and humiliation all have different blood responses. And I was like, well, we are way beyond my pay grade here.
It's good that Aaron Buckman is not here.
But I will tell you, for what it's worth, that there are kitvei yad of the Mishnah in Avot that talks about this that actually correct it to hama'adim pnei chaviro b'rabim, which is extremely interesting. Right? That is clearly a correction based on, what are you talking about? I've seen people and they're embarrassed. Right? Anyway, but the Malbin is very important for the generating this motif, because after all, the blood draining is like death. There's an amazing al-sheikh on Parshat Noach. He reads Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech as about humiliation. Spilling Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech. When you kill a person internally, when you spill his blood, that is, you cause it to drain out of his face, you are chayav mavet. Now, that is what we would say gently, not pshat in Parshat Noach. But it's incredibly beautiful and interesting. And he's on to the same idea, that the reason you can call it Avakrat Tzicha is not just a moral claim, and maybe not even just a psychological claim, but even me'ain a physiological claim. Right? That was neither Hebrew nor English. Okay. V'domeh l'Tzicha. Go ahead, please.
Isn't it
please.
possible to make somebody blush, but not to cause the kind of problem that's here? I'm sorry, I came late, so I don't.
No, it's interesting. I haven't seen anyone say that. I mean, are you asking you're asking a psychological, physiological question?
Psychology, physiology.
Not sure. I don't know.
There is a phenomenon of somebody paling at the possibility of something that is a far stronger response
Than blushing.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, the word that came to mind when you were saying that for what it's worth is the feeling of being mortified, which even means that, right? I mean, it's actually, we capture it in the same way in English. It's interesting. Go ahead. Let's try to just read through this fairly quickly now, okay? Ketzar bana marmi mavet, right? This is the first claim, right? Being humiliated is worse than being killed. And if that sounds hyperbolic, I want to just suggest, it took me a while to sort of register this. Imagine a moment in your life. And if you don't have moments like this, that are many, you could take a moment for Hodaya, right? But a moment in your life when you have felt totally humiliated, and you can hear the little voice says, I would rather be dead than standing right here. I think that's what he's talking about here. Tsar al bana marmi mavet. It's the worst thing. I'm still here. Right? There's nowhere to go. Right? I would rather... that's exactly what he's groping for here in this... and it's interesting here, Mish, to go to this point about this. This is Sharei Tshuva, right? So on the one hand, in this, he's really doing halacha, but he's also... He is, me'atzev, and, he's trying to shape a certain way of thinking about Ben Adam L'Chavero. Go ahead. Aken amru razal.
עצמו לכבשן האש ואל ילבין לפני חברו ברבים.
Here's one thing that's worth lihitakev on for 1 minute. The language of le'olam, that appears to be either his girsa or his introduction, makes it sound a little bit more closer to a chiyuv than noach lo. He's not there yet. Le'olam sounds like, this I have not yet done, looking at all the uses of le'olam in the Bavli, but le'olam, it sounds to the ear a little bit stronger than noach lo, because preferable to is a little different than always. Right? Le'olam, you could imagine how someone would make that leap. It took me actually like 15 times of learning this Rabbeinu Yonah to actually notice that, le'olam, which is actually different. I don't know if it's a girsa that he has. I'm not sure what's going on there. I assume it's a girsa that he has, which I've not seen yet anyplace else. Okay? V'lo amru kain. Sorry, go ahead. Dimu, right? Dimu. They compare. Yehareg. Okay, I think we can stop there for now. Now, I want to float a possibility here that I really am not totally persuaded by, but I want to just float it because I think it's interesting. Is that one of the reasons, you could say, why do Chazal learn this from Tamar? Well, that's the story they're reading. But if you think about them wanting to learn this lesson, I have been wondering whether they learn it from Tamar because this is a case with a person who she has the potential to humiliate, has treated her horrifically, has essentially taken advantage of his power over her, has, deprived her of any companionship for an extent, right? He's been horrible to her. And even in this instance, in their construction, she refuses to humiliate him in public. And what ends up happening there on an ethical level is a kind of kal v'chomer, meaning if Tamar doesn't do it, then almost every story you could possibly tell me about why you felt in that moment you were chayav to humiliate someone is basically ruled out of hand. That, in other words, it serves the argument very well to build it on a case that is so... Yehuda was horrible to her. And if you're interested in this, Robert Alter's reading of this story, which is like kind of the centerpiece in a way of the art of biblical narrative, he basically tries to show literarily how the text in muted ways, in Calvin tries to show like just horrifically Yehuda treats her. I mean, one of them is sort of amazing. He says, why did the text tell us that the moment his period of mourning is over, he goes out looking for sex? Alder says, because the text wants to tell you, how horrific is he to Tamar? She hasn't been able to touch anyone in like years. The first moment he has, he goes looking, right? I mean, Alter's reading of this is really quite amazing. And if you think about it that way, what I'm sort of suggesting is it really is this kind of, I don't know if kal v'chomer is exactly the right language, but maybe it is. It's like the envelope becomes so sweeping. Wait a second, if Tamar couldn't humiliate, you certainly can't humiliate.
It's very interesting that certainly Surim are learned out from kal v'chomer like that. The issur to hit someone is learned out from the Shliach Beitin who's administering Malkot.
Right.
So the person is a Russia. So the Shliach Beitin,
that's really nice.
He'll give him one more. You learn out the
issur.
And you also have Sheikh Ksut and owners learned out from Amma Ivriya. That the responsibility of the husband, even the Amma Ivriya, he has to treat her with respect.
That is really nice.
Those examples.
So that's great. So I think that's interesting here. Now, I'll just mention that I wrote a short little piece about this, and a friend of mine who's very interested in Foucault wrote me this like totally brutal response, which I think Chazal have an answer to, saying, oh, so you glorify a woman who's totally passive, who won't stand up for herself even in the worst possible situation. Sure you love this story? And I want to hold that. I don't fall into whether or not that's a good reading or not. Foucault is also a very sweeping envelope, right? I mean, there's nothing that it doesn't end up sweeping into its wake. But in a minute, I want to show you that I think actually, obviously not in those words, Chazal may have something like that in mind. Not the gender piece of it, I don't think, but the active, passive, powerless thing that's going on in this story. Okay? Now, number 7. The Meiri comes along, and Kedar Kova Kodesh, he just sticks a needle in this balloon with 2 words. He says, La'olam yizaher adam shlo yalbin pnei chavro berabim, derech tzachut amru. This is, right, Misha's point, like, derech tzachut will translate as, also hard, hyperbolically, as a figure of speech. That's not a figure of speech. Hyperbolically is better here, right? Amru, Noach lo la'adam she'apil atzmo l'toch yishana esh, abim mechavro b'rabim, minalan mitamar. So he basically says, come on, this is not a halachic source. What are you talking about? It's crazy, right? But again, the temptation to then say, oh, but it's not an important source, is like, that's the Jewish Yetzer Hara, right? No, it's still a huge deal, but obviously they can't say it's Yahrig Val Yavor. By the way, since we're going to run out of time at some point not so long from now, when I first taught this shiur, or version of this shiur, someone says to me that made me realize why, of course, it can't be Yahrig Val Yavor. This is like really interesting. This is a very American story. I'm giving the shiur last summer. It's like the first time I'm working through these sources. And guy stands up at the end of the shiur and says, I just want to tell you what I've been doing for work the last few months. I've been involved in basically destroying Joe Paterno's life. Joe Paterno, coach at Penn State, right, who basically protected his assistant coach, or didn't do anything about his assistant coach, who was raping kids. And he said, I wasn't trying to destroy Joe Paterno's life, but it was very clear to me that I was completely, he's not a particularly religious person, so his language, I was completely morally obligated to do whatever it took for there never to be another Joe Paterno in that situation. You tell me these sources think it's usher for me? I mean, I basically ruined his life. His whole family is like humiliated in ways you can't even imagine. Is that usher? And I realized something really important. One of the ways we might think in American legal language, I don't even know if you can say this in Hebrew. In American legal language, we might say that Yahrig Val Yavor is a law that's untrumpable. You can't trump it with anything else. That's what it means on some level, right? I think, put it this way, it's an implication if it's not a definition. And it seems to me, Malbim B'nei Chavro B'Rabim is dafka trumpable. Now, I'll tell you what I said to him in that moment, which I'm not completely...
Well, killing people is also trumpable. Kill people in war, you kill people in their road
but Ritzicha is not killing, it's murdering.
Okay.
No,
so,
I think...
So this is...
What do you say?
Hu yirtzach et harotzeach, and the Torah dafka talks about ritzichat mitzvah. I don't think that's...
You don't think that works?
But Bidbar Lamed Hey uses the word yirtzach to talk about...
Yes, it's true. But do Chazal ever? Because that would be a more...
Ritzichat mitzvah, not involved in Sanhedrin. I have
Wow.
about it. So, yeah.
I'm not going to mess with you anymore.
Yeah.
Interesting. So maybe it doesn't work. Maybe it doesn't work. Because I think in general, I think we do, at least conceptually, philosophically, make a distinction. We would very rarely actually say, right, murder becomes permitted in this situation. We would usually talk about killing. And we would even probably translate Ritzicha in those cases as killing, I would think.
Yeah,
No?
when the Torah, when the
I know.
Gemara
I hear you.
uses
I
the
hear you.
word
No.
ritzichat mitzvah, it's very deliberate.
Yeah. No, you're right. It's a really good point. I still think his point is very strong. By the way, after the session, someone came up to me and said, which I thought was like a more interesting question. He said, I'm a political journalist. This is what happens when you do these Yemei Iyun, right? It's like people come, he said, I'm a political journalist, and basically I spend my life humiliating politicians who have breached the public trusts. Do I have to quit my job? These questions are really interesting, right? So when I said to the guy, which I'm not quite sure I want to defend all the way down, but what I said to the guy who had said that thing about the Paterno case was, at very least, what this source might say is the moment when you find yourself acting in a particular way because you want to humiliate him, that is usher. The moment when he gets humiliated in your fulfillment of a mitzvah b'kuach nefesh, it's different. And by the way, this is why I think it's ethical guidance ultimately, and not a halachic statement, right? But that, in other words, the statement does not become again obsolete. It actually guides you into a context of what you're doing.
It's analogous, though. You can say it's analogous to the Isser Lashon Hara, right?
Yeah.
But it's mutter to speak Lashon Hara lachshosh, as if somebody's about to sign a business deal with someone, and you know that the guy is a crook. You can tell him, be careful.
Right.
Don't do it. He's a crook, because that's lachshosh. Right. So it's the same thing. If there's a danger, this person's going to do it again.
Right.
And other people will do it again. So then it's lachshosh.
Yeah, but no one says Lashon Hara is Yahrig Val Yavor.
I say, but I don't think that changes things in principle.
Well, you don't think that suggests that it's not Yahrig Val Yavor?
No.
Why?
Because Bezdin kills people, and you kill Rodfim. There's certain times when you kill people,
Yeah, still not
and that
totally persuaded that
the human
works.
human life can at times be secondary to other considerations.
Yeah, I would want to work that through philosophically, whether we really want to call those cases the same thing.
If the guy is a rodef for Gilead Arayis, Right? You can kill him because he's a road. You can kill him to prevent him from doing it. You can certainly embarrass him, it says, so to speak. You can embarrass him to stop him. You can kill him to stop him.
Yeah, but so what's the shmamina of that exactly for this?
That the case of Yehuda and Tamar is not a case where he's a rodev. He wasn't. He acted reprehensibly, but that's not. It's just a question of humiliating him for no reason.
Well, okay, but that, by the way, that is constricting the category in the most dramatic possible way. If the Isser is not humiliating someone for no reason, right? You've just patachta petach for every conceivable rationalization, right?
No, but it's not, the reason can't be nakama. Right? If
this I think is sarich yonos. I think we're in like an interesting ground here. Still not sure, but okay. Just to show you for a second, Yosef ends up being the other. This is the case that no one knows about, right? The Midrash Tanchuma decides that you can learn Noach lo Adam, right, from Yosef rather than Tamar. Why?
He didn't tell Yaakov.
No, it's interesting. It's amazing. What is Yosef doing like this? He's about to reveal his identity to 10 people who tried to murder him. And what does he do? Hotziu kol ishmei alai. Shmuel Bar Nachman, at least in the Tanchuma versions, actually for a different shiur, Breshit Rabbah and Tanchuma have two different versions of what Shmuel Bar Nachman says. They're totally different and really interesting. But in the Tanchuma version, Shmuel Bar Nachman says, what, was he insane? Right? You're about to reveal your identity to people and you say, everyone go out of the room. Why don't you call in reinforcements? He says, so what Yosef does here is reckless, it's irresponsible, and then he says no. He says, the end of that line in Tanchuma, this is source 10, Kach amar Yosef belibo, mutav she'ehareg v'lo avayesh et echai b'pnei HaMitzrim. I'd rather be killed. What I think is interesting about that is, again, I'm not sure this is really conscious, but Yosef is a situation where he has lots and lots of power and doesn't use it. There's something interesting about the contrast in Yosef and Tamar here. The situations they find themselves in. Right? Tamar like plays out a situation where she is totally without, she has ovedet etzot, she has nothing. He is in a situation here of like seemingly all the power in the world, and it's like an act of tzimtzum in a certain way. Like here, I'll give away all my power so as not levayesh et echai. That's something really interesting about that pairing. Now, yeah, go ahead.
It's not relevant here. There's the Chil Hashem, Achai b'fnei Mitzrim, is a Jewish, non-Jewish thing. It's like dirty laundry.
That's how you read this?
Lo avayesh et Achai b'fnei Mitzrim. Doesn't say lo levayesh otam. Et Achai b'fnei Mitzrim. I'm not sure, you can't derive from there the...
Really? Local kachni, really? That's interesting. I mean, I will defer to you, but I don't totally...
But both of the Midrashim are pasted onto the text. In neither case, or neither story, has anything to do with Halbanah Pnei Chaver Rabbi. I mean, both the shots of Tamar is she's genius. She knows how to work her powerlessness.
Yes, by the way, that I think is the... Right, exactly. In other words, what Chazal clearly decide to do is to read Tamar's decision as not about strategy, or, having her wits about her, but, a decision to read it as about, a kind of even self-sacrifice in the name of the ethical, in the name of honoring the other. Look, it doesn't seem to me in these stories, I mean, obviously this is totally speculative, that what's driving these principles is like an obsession with the pshat of the story, right? There's this like amped up, I like your formulation of this Ben Hashmashos principle, which I think is in a way almost looking for a peg, right? What's driving this, it seems to me, is a commitment to, I think Rabbeinu Yonah here is very astute, right? I think that probably what's driving it is, wait a second, right? There is a way in which humiliating someone is actually a form of violence that smacks of murder. And, interest of ending on time, I brought you here, number 13, Rav Eliyahu Cohen from Izmir, who's this kind of amazing darshan. His stuff is actually fascinating. Midrash Eliyahu, he actually says this like really interesting thing. He says actually halbana is a bigger deal than murder, because murder happens once and then it's over. It's like a really interesting statement. He says, and halbana, you spend your whole life basically afraid, what if the person who saw me humiliated sees me again? Ani achaved zeh od pam. Right, it's gonna happen again. If you think about like anything you know about trauma, right? The notion of like, something happens and like the past is present again. I mean, obviously he doesn't have that language, but that's kind of what he's saying. Like, I'm afraid, someone spoke to me horribly in front of Mish, and like, I see Mish again 2 years later, and it's like, oh my God, it's like back in my body again. It's like, it's right here. And so on that level, he says, again, this is also on some of an agadic statement, right? But it's a very powerful, compelling one, right? On some level, that's even worse, because it's never over. That's his sort of, that's his argument, it's never over. That's okay. So I think it's an interesting thing to play with. So I also brought, I don't know if exactly it's worth getting into at this time. The Pnei Yoshua on Bava Metzia is interesting, if only because he asks such a great classical learning question. He says, so we know this from Tamar. How did Tamar know it? Such a great achronish question, right? How did she know it? And what he says is actually interesting, which I'm still trying to understand exactly what he is and isn't doing there. The second to last line, Ela al korchacha de milta de pshita. It's an interesting statement. This goes back to your statement earlier, Bati, I think, about intuitive. Like, everybody knows this. Milta de pshita, what's the milta de pshita? De avon ze chamur mikola averot. But then the reason is, kevan she'en lo chelek olam haba. So he does give you like a textual thing. But I wonder what he's trying to do here. It reminds me a little bit of what Rav Amital used to say to people. If you need to go to a posek to ask whether it's okay to kill the prime minister, you're probably pretty insane already. You probably just need help. There's certain ethical questions that you don't need a posek for. You just need to have some functionality as a human being. And I really am not sure that the Pnei Yoshua is saying that, but I wonder if he opens the door to sort of saying that. What do you mean? Everybody knows what humiliation is if they actually stop and think about it. Everybody knows that. So, okay. So I think...
She was an Ishbitzer. Okay. So we talked about it.
In your everybody's an Ishbitzer. Yeah, go ahead.
Wasn't the Isser of Yehareg Val Yavor and Dafka the list of the three formulated because of a historical imperative? I mean, anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't, Halbanat Panim didn't fall into that category. And it seems to me like it's very parallel to Lamut al Kiddush Hashem that kind of carried through, for generations until Rav Nussbaum in the Warsaw Ghetto, came out with this psak halacha, lo et Lamut al Kiddush Hashem ala lechyot al Kiddush Hashem.
Rav Nissenbaum, Yitzchak Nissenbaum,
Rav
right?
Nissenbaum.
Yeah, exactly.
So, that it seems to me like the concept of Yehareg Val Yavor and the reason why those particular three.
Yes, you're very right. I would defer to you on this. You're the real rabbinic scholar here. I just to pretend. But I think, but even more than that, what you're saying is great. But I think you can see something even more simple. The scenario is not parallel, right? There's no scenario of im ba adam ve'omer lecha, hal benet paneha o shetamut.
But it wasn't an enemy. Like an enemy.
Yes, you're saying something even stronger. But I'm saying even in terms of the structure of the issue. Right? It's like a totally different case. And yes, it's not about the enemies of the Jews. It's actually about interpersonal ethics.
Well, your argument also applies to holy. Right? Not only to someone outside forcing you, but I can't kill someone.
Right. That's true.
If I need their body.
So would you say
if I need a heart transplant, I can't kill somebody to take their heart.
Would
right?
you say that there's a sort of like a psychological dachaf would be the same thing? Yeah. Yeah, you probably would say that. I think you should say that probably. Yeah, please. Just say your name because you weren't here. Nina? Rina.
I would posit that Yosef would have sent his brothers out so that they would actually not have their lives endangered. I think he had a position of power in Mitzrayim. The Mitzrayim would have defended him and killed his brothers had they found out the treachery that he was telling them about.
So if you're right, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So that would be a perfectly legitimate reason to send everybody out and disclose without them there, particularly with the actions that Yosef had taken beforehand to make them look bad.
But I actually think, I don't know if this is what you need to be doing, you're bolstering the reading whereby the more we open up that there are plausible other ways to understand these stories, ironically, the stronger these readings become. Not because they're necessary pshat, but because they're making a point that they're choosing to make. Right? It bolsters this sort of exegetical audacity, as it were, of these texts. Say, yes, you could read it otherwise, but they're choosing not to. I think that's part of the power.
Well, I would say that that's definitely a possibility, but that's not what I'm doing here. I
Oh,
think
so
this
sorry, go ahead.
story is much less of a halbanat pnei chavero greda story, whereas Tamar had the option to be malbin, not her chaver, but Yehuda, who did not behave as a chaver to her in any way. She had that option there, and she did not. Here, it's already tainted with other stuff, and yes, it does give a different read to what halbanat pnei chavero means, because it could be that there's collateral damage when you are malbin pnei chavero b'rabim, because there's rabim, and you don't know how they're going to respond.
So here's what I suspect drives these as parallels, which is not an answer to what you're saying. It's just like another, iron to throw in the fire in a way. Is that this too is a case where the people he's protecting have behaved unimaginably horrifically towards him. And I think that part, again, there's something about that, the desire to take these crazy cases, that is actually, I suspect, part of what's driving Dafka these stories being used. Right? It's like, really, your brothers? These Mitzias? Really? Of course, what makes it more complicated, of course, is he's probably witnessed them doing tshuva. I mean, if you read the narrative in Breshit, he certainly witnesses their regret, right? So it makes the story yet another reason why it's not the pshat of the story that he's risking his life. It doesn't seem like he thinks he's risking his life in the pshat of Breshit there.
He doesn't witness their tshuva. He orchestrates.
Right. Well, that's for sure true. I mean, right. But for this story, I'm not sure the orchestration adds to it. The issue is that he sees it's happening, so he's less scared of them. Orchestrating it does not yet eliminate his fear. Seeing that they're actually changing eliminates his fear.
The real fear
No?
for him is his embarrassment, I think. There's an irony here. If he's the big king of Egypt, they all love him, and if he tells them, by the way, my family couldn't stand me. They wanted to kill me. They thought I was nothing. To me, the most embarrassing part is for him. That's why I would have said to everyone else. I don't
It's the humiliation of the victim.
That's
That's what you're saying. That's interesting.
It's so funny. By the way, we learn a lot about ourselves from the pshat of the story. I always thought the pshat of the story was that he was a guy and found it scary to think about crying in front of a bunch of other people. Really? Honestly, I always thought the pshat of that story was. I really did. I'm totally not kidding. I've always thought that's the pshat of the story.
You have to know if men cried in ancient Egypt.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So here's mamish, the last sentence I want to say to you. The last sources here are. It's not crazy. It's not so crazy. The last stories here really have nothing to do explicitly with this, but I find them really interesting. So one of the things I've been thinking about is how do we, as religious educators, as moral educators, as human beings trying to educate ourselves, learn to take seriously, more and more seriously, that there are very few things in the world as grave that is put in our hands as the dignity of a person in front of us. And I wanted to share with you something that I have been thinking about, just literally 2 more minutes, I'm sorry. After. So 2 more minutes, that I found this so far, I'm sure there are other sources. So far I have found this in 3 very different places. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, the Sfas Emes, and Rav Yerucham Levovitz of Mir. Okay? These are not exactly this is not an askola, as we say in academia. This is not like a group of people, right? This is interesting. And what they're all doing is riffing on the Mishnah in Avot, famous Mishnah, Ezu Mechubad and Mechabedet Habriot, right? Who is honored, I think you'll probably translate this, one who honors human beings. And the proof text, which is probably doing on the surface just a very simple thing, the proof text, Shne'emar ki mechabdaya chabed uvozaye kalu, from Shmuel Aleph, right? That is to say, it's an example of a case where, right, mechabdaya chabed, those who treat with respect will be treated with respect. But what Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, the Sfas Emes, and the Mashgiach from Mir all come up with is, wait a second, this proof text makes no sense. This may be a manufactured shaila, but it's actually very interesting what it generates. They all come up with it. Wait a second. This is about mechabdai. It's about God. Why would you learn about kibud achirim from kibud why would you learn from kvod adam or kvod abriot from kvod Hashem? They all say because the greatest manifestation of kvod Hashem in the world is kvod adam. right? That on some level it is. So Rabbeinu Yerucham, he's this amazing thing here, right? He says, "Umanifla lefi dvarenu divrei Chazal b'Mishnah izu mechubad mechet abriot shene'amar k'matay Beid v'tamur rishonim eize raya mimikra zeh harei Mishnah mayre mikvod abriot v'lefi dvarenu harei advarim kipshutan shemechabedet habriot u'mechabedet hamakom mamash." Then kvod tzelem Elokim hu kvod tzelem Elokim hu kvod Elokim mamash v'zehu ki mechabdai achabed. Now, this is not Levinas. This is not. I understand there are some people, especially in Israel, who don't think this is what Levinas is saying, and I have no investment in this. But this is not the reduction of God to a metaphor for the ethical, which is what at least most European and American interpreters of Levinas think Levinas is doing, right? It's just a way of talking about the obligation I have to the other. Rabbeinu Yerucham thinks there's a Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? It's really God. He's a metaphysical realist, if you're going to push him on this question, right? There's really God out there. But in the end of the day, like, what is the greatest access to Kvod Hashem we have? Right here, Kvod Adam. And Mechabdai Achabed is the Mishnah's quiet way. Again, I'm not invested in this being Pshat and Pirkei Avot. It doesn't matter, right? I don't think they would be invested in that either, to be honest, right? Like, oh, what is Mechabdai Achabed? It's telling me, right, Mechabedet HaBriot, Mechabedet HaElohim. V'ha-mizalzel b'briot, ha-mashpil et ha-briot, ha-malbin et pnei chavirot b'rabim, at some level, right, is... you know, you can't malbinat Hashem. You don't understand what I mean, right? Is mizalzel b'chodosh l'kadosh baruch hu. You have this, by the way, in a book that no Jews ever read, which makes me very sad. Sefer Mishlei. There's at least 6 psukim I found so far. It's not like a great, that actually make it very clear that the kavod of poor people is kavod Hashem. Most famous one, right? It's Mishlei Yud Zayin, Loegla Rash Cheref Osehu. You mock the poor, you degrade God. By the way, if you're American, if you ever hang out with Christians, you know one of the most famous psukim in the Gospel of Matthew that all liberal Christians like to talk about, right? As you have done to the least of these, so have you done to me. Jesus, I think, in the Gospel of Matthew is playing with Proverbs. And interestingly, as I've been looking at recent commentaries on Matthew, that's becoming like an interesting trope. That when Jesus says that, right, he's actually riffing on a motif that is available to his listeners from the book of Proverbs. What do you mean? Of course. You degrade a poor person, you're degrading God. And since on some level, right, you can play out the rest of this, on your own. But I think it's really interesting. And again, is that really what underlies the Malbin discussion? I don't know. I wouldn't argue that explicitly, but I think implicitly some intuition about that, about the sheer irreducible preciousness of the dignity of the person in front of you, is what animates it, and I think it's what leads to this sort of hyperbolic explosion around these sources, where they keep getting amped up and amped up and amped up, as a way of basically saying, this is the most precious thing in the world, right? So live that way. Shkaya.